The crystal goblet slipped from Colonel Henry Blackwood's trembling fingers, shattering against the polished mahogany floor as his body convulsed in the dining chair where he had moments before been toasting American liberty. Around the table, 73 guests writhed in agony, their Independence Day celebration transforming into a symphony of retching and gasping as the cornbread they had praised so enthusiastically now delivered death with every bite. In the kitchen doorway, Isaac Williams stood motionless, his dark hands folded over his white apron, watching the carefully orchestrated collapse of Riverside Oaks Plantation's most treasured tradition. The same hands that had kneaded the bread for this feast had spent 3 months extracting poison from the oleander flowers that bloomed so beautifully along the mansion's wraparound porch. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of July 4, 1857, dawned with the oppressive humidity that clung to the Georgia lowlands like a suffocating blanket, the air thick with the scent of magnolia blossoms, and the distant promise of thunderstorms rolling in from the Atlantic. Riverside Oaks Plantation stretched across 2,800 acres of fertile bottomland along the Savannah River, its fields heavy with cotton that would soon make Colonel Blackwood one of the wealthiest men in Georgia. The plantation's reputation extended far beyond its agricultural success. However, as the Blackwood family had earned renown throughout the region for their elaborate 4th of July celebrations that drew the elite from 5 counties to feast, drink and celebrate the freedoms that defined their way of life, Isaac Williams had risen before dawn in the slave quarters, his weathered hands already steady with the knowledge of what this day would bring. At 45, he had served as head cook at Riverside Oaks for 27 years, arriving as a teenager when the current colonel's father had purchased him from an estate sale in Charleston. Those decades had taught him the rhythms of plantation life, the subtle languages of survival, and the precise timing required to feed 200 people without attracting suspicion. But more importantly, they had taught him patience, the kind of patience that could wait months for the perfect moment to transform a celebration of American independence into something far more personal and permanent. The kitchen house stood apart from the main mansion, connected by a covered walkway that allowed servants to move between buildings while maintaining the illusion of separation that white society demanded. Isaac's domain contained 3 massive brick hearths, dozens of cast-iron pots, and the accumulated knowledge of nearly 3 decades spent feeding the appetites of people who considered him property. The herb garden outside the kitchen door provided seasonings for daily meals, but it also contained other plants whose properties Isaac had studied with the dedication of a scholar, plants whose secrets could heal or harm depending on the knowledge and intention of the person who understood their nature. Ruth Williams emerged from the darkness of their cabin as the first hints of dawn colored the eastern sky, her movements careful and deliberate as she prepared for what would be the most important day of their lives. At 42, she had spent 19 years as the plantation's head seamstress, responsible for maintaining the elaborate wardrobes that announced the Blackwood family's wealth and status to visitors. Her position required her to move freely through the main house, accessing bedrooms, sitting rooms and private spaces where conversations revealed information that could prove valuable to those who knew how to listen. Ruth possessed the kind of intelligence that white society never recognized in enslaved women, the ability to process complex information while maintaining the appearance of simple domestic competence. Their daughter Sarah, 16 and beautiful in ways that attracted dangerous attention from white men, had been assigned to serve in the main house since her 14th birthday. The work required her to be present during family meals, social gatherings, and private conversations that revealed the true nature of the people she served. Sarah had learned to make herself invisible while remaining constantly aware, developing the skills that allowed her to move through white spaces without triggering the suspicions or desires that could destroy her life. Her position also provided access to the dining room, pantry, and serving areas where food would be prepared and distributed during the Independence Day celebration. Benjamin, their 19-year-old son, worked the cotton fields under the supervision of overseers who measured human worth in pounds of cotton picked per day. His physical strength and intelligence had made him valuable to the plantation's operations, but those same qualities had also made him a target for the casual violence that maintained the social order. Benjamin understood the mathematics of plantation economics, the way human bodies were calculated as assets and depreciated like machinery when they could no longer produce maximum profits. His work in the fields had shown him the network of communication that existed among the enslaved population, the subtle signals and coded conversations that allowed information to travel faster than any white person imagined possible. The youngest member of the Williams family had been 12-year-old David, whose quick mind and gentle nature had made him beloved among both the enslaved community and the Blackwood children who had grown up alongside him. David's intelligence had manifested in his ability to read and write, skills he had acquired secretly by observing lessons given to the Blackwood children and practicing with materials stolen from the main house. But that same intelligence had led him to question the contradictions he observed between the Christian teachings preached every Sunday and the daily realities of plantation life. His questions had eventually evolved into something white society could not tolerate, a quiet defiance that challenged the fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy and divine approval of slavery. The breaking point had come 3 months earlier, on April 15, when Master Charles Blackwood had cornered Sarah in the sewing room, his hands reaching for places that belonged to her alone while his voice carried the casual assumption of ownership that defined every interaction between white men and enslaved women. David had entered the room at precisely the wrong moment, witnessing his sister's terror and his future master's intentions with a clarity that stripped away any remaining illusions about the nature of their circumstances. The confrontation that followed lasted less than 3 minutes, but it changed everything for the Williams family and sealed David's fate with the efficiency of a legal judgment. Charles Blackwood possessed the casual cruelty that came naturally to young men raised to believe their desires superseded other people's humanity. At 24 he had already established a reputation for the kind of violence that other plantation families quietly tolerated as part of maintaining social order. His assumption that Sarah would submit to his advances without resistance reflected the broader assumptions of a society that treated enslaved women as sexual property available for the pleasure of white men. But David's intervention had challenged not just Charles's immediate desires but the entire framework of power that allowed such assumptions to exist without consequences. The words David spoke during those crucial minutes would haunt the Williams family for months afterward. His declaration that Sarah was a human being deserving of respect and protection had struck Charles with the force of blasphemy, a denial of natural law that could not be permitted to stand without punishment. The physical confrontation that followed left Charles with a bruised jaw and wounded pride, injuries that demanded retaliation far beyond anything David's actions might have warranted under different circumstances. But in the context of plantation society, where the slightest resistance to white authority could trigger brutal reprisals, David's defense of his sister represented something approaching open rebellion. Colonel Blackwood's response had been swift and calculated, designed to send a message that would resonate throughout the enslaved community for years to come. David would be sold immediately to a cotton plantation in Alabama, separated from his family as punishment for his insolence while generating profit that would partially compensate for the disruption he had caused. The sale was presented as temporary discipline, a chance for David to learn proper respect for authority before being allowed to return to his family. But the Williams family understood the reality behind such promises, the way temporary separations often became permanent losses when economic opportunities or personal vendettas made reunion inconvenient. The cotton plantation in Alabama where David was sold operated under conditions that made Riverside Oaks seem merciful by comparison. The work demanded 16-hour days during harvest season, with minimal food and shelter provided to workers who were expected to generate maximum profits with minimal investment in their survival. Overseers employed methods of discipline that went beyond the casual violence.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
It's common on Georgia plantations, using systematic brutality to extract labor from people who were considered expendable resources rather than valuable property worth preserving. David's death came 6 weeks after his arrival in Alabama, the result of exhaustion, malnutrition and injuries sustained during punishment for failing to meet daily quotas that had been set beyond human capacity. The news reached Riverside Oaks through the network of communication that connected enslaved communities across the South, traveling through coded songs, secret meetings, and whispered conversations that carried information faster than official correspondence. The message that reached Isaac and Ruth Williams contained details that made David's suffering clear, descriptions of his final weeks that transformed grief into something harder and more dangerous. The funeral that never happened became a turning point for the Williams family, the moment when their individual sorrow crystallized into collective purpose. Isaac had buried other family members during his years at Riverside Oaks, but David's death represented something different, a loss that demanded more than tears and prayers. The casual manner in which the Blackwood family discussed David's fate, referring to him as a business expense that hadn't generated expected returns, revealed the fundamental impossibility of achieving justice through appeals to conscience or humanity. Ruth's response to David's death manifested in careful planning that drew upon decades of observation and accumulated knowledge about the vulnerabilities in plantation security. Her access to the main house provided detailed information about family routines, guest lists for social events, and the logistical requirements for entertaining large numbers of visitors. She understood the timing of deliveries, the schedules of servants, and the patterns of supervision that created opportunities for someone clever enough to exploit them. Sarah's grief transformed into something approaching hatred, a focused intensity that allowed her to maintain her performance as the obedient house servant, while calculating opportunities for revenge. Her position required her to serve meals, clean rooms, and interact with family members who treated her as invisible furniture, never considering that she might possess the intelligence and motivation to threaten their security. Her youth and apparent innocence provided perfect camouflage for activities that would have triggered immediate suspicion if conducted by older, more obviously dangerous members of the enslaved community. Benjamin channeled his anger into systematic observation of plantation operations, identifying weaknesses in security that could be exploited during times of celebration when normal routines were disrupted. His work in the fields provided access to information about neighboring plantations, the movement of patrols, and the communication networks that connected enslaved communities throughout the region. Benjamin understood that successful resistance required more than individual courage. It demanded careful coordination and the support of people who shared common interests in challenging the system that oppressed them all. The decision to target the 4th of July celebration emerged from months of planning that considered multiple factors beyond simple revenge. The holiday gathering would bring together the largest concentration of plantation elite in the region, creating an opportunity to deliver a message that would resonate far beyond Riverside Oaks. The irony of using Independence Day as the occasion for their own declaration of freedom provided symbolic power that transformed personal vengeance into political statement. The timing also offered practical advantages, as the disruption of normal routines during party preparations would create cover for activities that might otherwise attract attention. Isaac's role as head cook positioned him perfectly to orchestrate the poisoning, but the complexity of feeding 75 guests required coordination that involved the entire family. Ruth would gather intelligence about guest preferences, seating arrangements, and serving protocols that would determine how poison could be distributed most effectively. Sarah would ensure that contaminated food reached specific targets while avoiding the enslaved servants who would be required to taste dishes before serving them to guests. Benjamin would coordinate with outside contacts who could provide assistance if the family needed to escape quickly after their actions were discovered. The poison itself came from oleander flowers that bloomed throughout the plantation grounds, beautiful pink and white blossoms that most people admired without understanding their deadly properties. Isaac had studied the plant's characteristics through careful experimentation with small animals, learning how to extract and concentrate the toxins that could kill a human being within hours of consumption. The process required weeks of preparation, slowly collecting flowers and processing them into a concentrated essence that could be mixed into food without altering taste or appearance. The extraction process demanded precision that Isaac had developed through decades of cooking experience, the ability to control temperature, timing, and concentration with mathematical accuracy. He had discovered that oleander toxins concentrated most effectively when flowers were dried, and then steeped in cooking oil over low heat for extended periods. The resulting essence could be stored indefinitely without losing potency, providing flexibility and timing that allowed him to prepare the poison months in advance while waiting for the perfect opportunity to deploy it. Storage of the poison required security measures that protected both the substance and the family from discovery. Isaac had constructed a false bottom in one of his spice containers, creating a hiding place that appeared to contain ordinary cooking ingredients while concealing enough concentrated oleander essence to kill dozens of people. The hiding place was designed to pass casual inspection while providing quick access when the time came to contaminate food for the Independence Day feast. Distribution planning focused on cornbread and fruit preserves, traditional holiday foods that would be consumed by every guest while allowing for precise control over dosage. Isaac calculated that mixing the essence into cornbread batter would ensure even distribution throughout the bread, while adding it to preserves would provide concentrated doses for guests who consumed larger quantities. The combination would guarantee that every person at the celebration received a potentially lethal dose while making it difficult for medical authorities to identify the source of the poisoning. The Williams family understood that their actions would trigger investigations that could expose and destroy enslaved communities throughout the region. Professional slave catchers and federal marshals would interrogate everyone associated with the plantation, using methods of persuasion that could break even the strongest resistance. The family had prepared for this possibility by developing cover stories that would explain their actions as loyal servants trying to save their masters from accidental poisoning, transforming themselves from perpetrators into heroes who had risked their lives to protect white families. But the deeper motivation behind their plan extended beyond simple revenge or even the desire for justice. The Williams family had concluded that the system of slavery could only be challenged through actions that forced white society to confront the fundamental contradictions in their beliefs about racial hierarchy and divine approval of human bondage. David's death had demonstrated the impossibility of achieving change through appeals to conscience or humanity, leaving violence as the only language that slaveholders would understand and respect. The network of resistance that supported their planning included contacts throughout the region, enslaved people who shared information about plantation security, escape routes, and opportunities for coordinated action. These connections had developed over decades through church gatherings, market days, and the movement of people between plantations that created opportunities for communication and mutual support. The Williams family's plan represented one component of a broader pattern of resistance that operated beneath the surface of apparent compliance throughout the antebellum South. As the morning of July 4th progressed toward the dinner hour, when guests would begin arriving for the celebration, Isaac Williams stood in his kitchen surrounded by the implements and ingredients that would transform a festive meal into an instrument of judgment. The cornbread batter waited in large bowls, ready to receive the essence that would carry death to the dining tables where Georgia's elite would gather to celebrate freedoms they denied to others. The irony was not lost on him that he would use the holiday dedicated to American independence to declare his own family's freedom from the system that had enslaved them for decades. The institutional machinery of Blackwood County responded to the Williams family's actions with the predictable efficiency of a system designed to protect white interests above all other considerations. Dr. William Patterson arrived at Riverside Oaks within 2 hours of the first reports of mass illness, his leather medical bag containing instruments and remedies that would prove useless against the oleander toxins coursing through the bloodstreams of 73 victims. The physician had treated isolated cases of food poisoning during his 15 years of practice, but nothing had prepared him for the scale of suffering that greeted him in the mansion's dining room and adjacent parlors where guests writhed in various stages of toxicity. The symptoms presented with textbook consistency that should have immediately suggested intentional poisoning, but Dr. Patterson's assumptions about plantation security prevented him from considering such possibilities. Violent nausea, irregular heartbeat, confusion and progressive weakness affected every person who had consumed the cornbread and preserves, creating a pattern that pointed directly toward contamination of specific food items. But the doctor's experience had conditioned him to look for natural explanations that would preserve the social order, rather than criminal causes that might threaten the foundations of local society. His initial diagnosis focused on spoiled meat or contaminated water, explanations that would absolve everyone of responsibility while attributing the tragedy to unfortunate circumstances beyond human control. The 4th of July heat had created ideal conditions for bacterial growth in food that might have been improperly stored or prepared, providing a convenient explanation that required no investigation into the loyalty or competence of enslaved cooks who had prepared the fatal meal. Dr. Patterson's medical training had taught him to look for common causes rather than exotic possibilities, leading him toward conclusions that protected established assumptions about plantation management and enslaved behavior. The Blackwood County Sheriff Robert Davidson conducted his investigation with the same assumptions that had guided the physician's diagnosis. Sheriff Davidson had maintained order in the county for 12 years through a combination of personal relationships with prominent families and an intuitive understanding of which crimes required serious investigation versus those that could be resolved through informal arrangements. His experience had taught him that maintaining social stability often mattered more than achieving perfect justice, especially when perfect justice might threaten the economic foundations that supported the entire community. The sheriff's questioning of the Williams family followed established protocols designed to confirm their innocence rather than expose their guilt. Isaac answered questions about food preparation with the detailed knowledge that 27 years of cooking experience had provided, explaining the sources of ingredients, timing of preparation and storage methods that had been used for the Independence Day feast. His responses demonstrated the competence and attention to detail that white society expected from valuable enslaved property, reinforcing assumptions about his loyalty and reliability rather than raising suspicions about his potential for deception. Ruth's interrogation focused on her observations of guest behavior during the meal, questions that allowed her to demonstrate appropriate concern for the welfare of white families, while providing information that supported the accidental poisoning theory. Her detailed recollections of who had eaten what foods and when symptoms had first appeared provided crucial intelligence that helped authorities construct a timeline consistent with food contamination rather than deliberate murder. Ruth's performance as the worried servant whose reputation depended on the family's continued health convinced investigators that she shared their interest in identifying natural causes rather than criminal intent. Sarah's youth and apparent innocence provided perfect protection against serious suspicion, as investigators found it inconceivable that a 16-year-old enslaved girl could possess the knowledge and determination required to orchestrate mass murder. Her tears during questioning appeared to reflect genuine distress over the suffering she had witnessed, tears that actually expressed relief over the successful completion of their carefully planned revenge. Sarah's ability to maintain emotional consistency while providing factually accurate information about her service duties demonstrated the psychological sophistication that slavery had forced her to develop as a survival mechanism. Benjamin's alibi as a field hand who had no access to food preparation eliminated him from consideration as a suspect, despite his obvious intelligence and potential capacity for planning complex operations. The investigators' assumptions about the division of labor on plantations prevented them from recognizing that field hands often possessed detailed knowledge about main house operations and could easily coordinate with family members who worked in different areas. Benjamin's emotional responses to questions about the tragedy reflected appropriate concern for the plantation's welfare while concealing his satisfaction over the successful destruction of the system that had killed his younger brother. The official conclusion that emerged from these investigations attributed the mass poisoning to contaminated preserves that had been improperly canned during the previous autumn, creating conditions that allowed botulism bacteria to develop toxins that could kill entire families who consumed infected food. This explanation satisfied medical authorities who needed a diagnosis that fit established patterns of foodborne illness while providing legal authorities with a conclusion that required no arrests or prosecutions that might threaten social stability. The Williams family's careful planning had created a scenario where the truth was literally unthinkable within the framework of assumptions that governed white society's understanding of enslaved behavior and capabilities. The coroner's report filed with Blackwood County authorities on July 8, 1857, listed natural causes as the official explanation for 73 deaths that had occurred during the Independence Day celebration at Riverside Oaks Plantation. The document's clinical language concealed the political implications of accepting such conclusions, as acknowledging deliberate poisoning would have required admitting that enslaved people possessed the intelligence, coordination, and motivation necessary to conduct sophisticated operations against their owners. Such admissions would have threatened the fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy and natural subservience that justified the entire institution of slavery. The timing of the Williams family's revenge demonstrated strategic thinking that extended far beyond simple emotional reaction to personal grief. The 4th of July celebration represented the peak of the plantation's social calendar, drawing together the largest concentration of political and economic leadership that gathered anywhere in the region during the entire year. The guest list included county commissioners, state legislators, federal judges and wealthy planters whose combined influence shaped policy decisions that affected thousands of enslaved people throughout Georgia. The Williams family had essentially decapitated the local power structure while delivering a symbolic message about the true meaning of American independence. The choice of Independence Day also provided cover for their escape plans, as the holiday's traditional chaos created opportunities for movement that would have been impossible during normal plantation routines. Roads filled with travelers visiting family members, conducting business or attending celebrations in neighboring counties, providing perfect camouflage for people who needed to disappear quickly without attracting attention. The Williams family had coordinated with underground contacts who operated ferry services across the Savannah River, positioning themselves to reach South Carolina within hours of completing their mission if circumstances required immediate flight from Georgia. The method of poison delivery had been calculated to ensure maximum impact while minimizing the possibility of survival that might allow victims to identify the source of their suffering. Isaac's knowledge of oleander toxicity had come from years of observing its effects on livestock that accidentally consumed the plant while grazing in areas where ornamental landscaping mixed with pasture land. The symptoms appeared gradually, allowing victims to consume full portions of contaminated food before realizing they had been poisoned, ensuring that everyone who attended the celebration received potentially lethal doses regardless of their individual eating habits or preferences. The concentration of toxins in cornbread and preserves guaranteed that even guests who ate sparingly would consume enough poison to cause serious illness, while those who enjoyed multiple servings would receive doses that made survival unlikely even with immediate medical intervention. Isaac had tested different concentrations using chickens and pigs over several months, developing precise measurements that could kill adult humans without creating immediate symptoms that might alert victims to seek help before the poison had completed its work. The delayed reaction time also prevented guests from connecting their illness to specific foods, maintaining the Williams family's cover story about accidental contamination. The preservation of evidence that might implicate the family had required elaborate deception that began weeks before the actual poisoning and continued for months afterward. Isaac had disposed of the containers used to extract oleander essence by burning them in cooking fires that left no trace of their specialized purpose, while mixing the ashes with normal kitchen waste that would be spread as fertilizer throughout the plantation's garden areas. The false bottom in his spice container had been designed to collapse and blend with ordinary seasonings if subjected to careful examination, destroying evidence while making such destruction appear accidental. Ruth had systematically removed or altered any documentation that might reveal the family's planning activities, including letters from contacts in other states and maps showing escape routes that connected Georgia plantations to free territory in the north. Her access to the main house had allowed her to monitor official correspondence between the Blackwoods and legal authorities, providing advance warning about investigation procedures that might threaten their security. Ruth's ability to read and write, skills that most white people assumed enslaved women did not possess, had proven crucial for intelligence gathering that kept the family ahead of potential threats. Sarah's role had involved maintaining behavioral consistency that would convince observers she remained the same innocent girl who had served the family faithfully for 2 years before the poisoning occurred. Her ability to express appropriate grief over the deaths of people she had deliberately killed demonstrated psychological control that reflected the emotional compartmentalization slavery had forced her to develop as protection against daily trauma. Sarah's youth provided natural explanation for any inconsistencies in her performance, as investigators expected teenage girls to display emotional instability under stressful circumstances regardless of their potential guilt or innocence. Benjamin's coordination with external contacts had established communication networks that could support the family's escape if their cover story failed to protect them from prosecution. His work in the fields had provided opportunities to meet with underground conductors who moved escaped slaves through the region, creating relationships that could be activated quickly if the Williams family needed to flee Georgia before their deception was discovered. Benjamin had also identified potential safe houses and river crossing points that could support their journey toward free territory if remaining at Riverside Oaks became impossible. The psychological impact of their successful revenge had created unexpected challenges for family members who discovered that achieving justice did not necessarily provide the emotional satisfaction they had anticipated. Isaac found himself experiencing moments of profound emptiness that followed the completion of goals that had sustained him through months of careful planning and dangerous preparation. The deaths of 73 people, including children and elderly visitors who had played no direct role in David's murder, forced him to confront moral complexities that simple revenge fantasies had not prepared him to handle. Ruth struggled with the knowledge that their actions had eliminated families whose children would grow up as orphans, creating suffering that extended far beyond the immediate victims of their poisoning campaign. Her understanding of social connections throughout the region allowed her to calculate the broader consequences of removing so many prominent figures from positions of leadership and influence. The power vacuum created by their deaths would be filled by people whose attitudes toward enslaved populations might prove even more brutal than those of the families they had destroyed. Sarah's experience of serving poisoned food to people who trusted her completely had required a level of deception that challenged her fundamental sense of identity and moral boundaries. The psychological compartmentalization necessary to maintain her performance while orchestrating mass murder had created internal divisions that would affect her relationships and emotional stability for years to come. Sarah discovered that successful resistance could exact psychological costs that were nearly as devastating as the oppression it was designed to overcome. Benjamin faced the realization that their revenge had provided only temporary satisfaction while failing to address the systemic conditions that had made David's death possible in the first place. The institution of slavery would continue operating with new personnel replacing those who had been eliminated, while the underlying economic and legal structures that supported human bondage remained completely intact. Benjamin began to understand that meaningful change would require sustained resistance over decades rather than spectacular acts of violence that generated headlines but failed to transform fundamental power relationships. The network of underground contacts who had supported their planning expressed mixed reactions to the Williams family's successful operation, recognizing both its symbolic importance and its potential for triggering brutal reprisals against enslaved communities throughout the region. Some conductors praised the family's courage and effectiveness in striking back against their oppressors, viewing the mass poisoning as a necessary demonstration that enslaved people possessed the capacity to fight back against systematic brutality. Other network members worried that such dramatic actions would provoke increased surveillance and punishment that would make future rescue operations more difficult and dangerous for everyone involved. The ripple effects of the Independence Day poisoning extended throughout Georgia and neighboring states as news of the tragedy spread through both official channels and underground communication networks that connected enslaved communities across the South. White families increased security measures around food preparation and service, implementing new protocols that required multiple people to supervise meal planning and execution while restricting enslaved access to ingredients that could be used for harmful purposes. These changes created additional barriers to resistance while demonstrating that the Williams family's actions had forced white society to acknowledge vulnerabilities they had previously ignored. The federal response to reports of mass poisoning at a prominent Georgia plantation included increased funding for slave patrol operations and expanded legal authority for investigating potential conspiracies among enslaved populations. Federal marshals received instructions to monitor Underground Railroad activities more closely while coordinating with local authorities to identify and prosecute anyone suspected of assisting escape attempts or planning resistance operations. The Williams family's success had inadvertently contributed to creating a more repressive environment that would affect thousands of people who had played no role in their revenge. The economic consequences of eliminating so many wealthy planters during a single event disrupted regional markets and delayed political decisions that might have affected the future development of slavery in Georgia. The concentration of deaths among prominent families created inheritance disputes that tied up substantial assets in legal proceedings while transferring control of plantations to younger relatives who lacked experience managing large-scale agricultural operations. Some properties were sold to cover debts or settle estate disputes, creating opportunities for land ownership patterns to shift in ways that might provide new possibilities for resistance or escape. The symbolic significance of using Independence Day as the occasion for their declaration of personal freedom had created connections between the Williams family's actions and the broader national debate over slavery that was building toward eventual civil war. Abolitionists in northern states seized upon the story as evidence that enslaved people possessed the intelligence and determination necessary to claim their own liberty through direct action when legal and political processes failed to provide justice. Southern defenders of slavery responded by arguing that the poisoning demonstrated the dangerous consequences of allowing anti-slavery sentiment to encourage resistance that threatened the safety of white families throughout the region. The medical knowledge that Isaac had acquired through his study of oleander toxicity represented a form of intellectual achievement that challenged fundamental assumptions about the mental capabilities of enslaved people. His ability to conduct systematic experiments, calculate precise dosages, and execute complex plans demonstrated scientific thinking that white society insisted was beyond the capacity of people of African descent. The success of his poisoning operation provided undeniable evidence that enslaved people possessed sophisticated intelligence that could be directed toward purposes their owners never anticipated or prepared to defend against. The coordination required to involve 4 family members in a complex operation while maintaining perfect security demonstrated organizational skills that paralleled those employed by military units or business enterprises operating under hostile conditions. The Williams family had essentially functioned as an intelligence network that gathered information, analyzed weaknesses, developed strategies, and executed coordinated actions that achieved their objectives while avoiding detection by authorities who possessed superior resources and legal authority. Their success challenged assumptions about the natural subservience of enslaved people while proving that resistance could be far more sophisticated than simple acts of individual defiance or escape. The transformation of a family celebration into an instrument of mass murder had required psychological preparation that enabled each family member to compartmentalize their emotions while maintaining behavioral consistency under extreme stress. The Williams family had needed to appear genuinely concerned about the welfare of people they were actively killing, expressing appropriate grief over deaths they had deliberately caused while providing assistance to investigators who were trying to solve crimes they had committed. The psychological sophistication required for such sustained deception challenged stereotypes about the emotional simplicity of enslaved people while demonstrating capabilities that white society found threatening to acknowledge. The long-term consequences of their actions would unfold over months and years as the Williams family continued living at Riverside Oaks under the increased scrutiny that followed any major tragedy affecting prominent white families. Their ability to maintain their cover story while adapting to new security measures would determine whether their successful revenge remained a secret victory or eventually became evidence that could destroy them along with anyone who had provided assistance or concealed knowledge about their activities. The true test of their achievement would be measured not just by their immediate success in killing their enemies, but by their capacity to survive the aftermath while preserving the possibilities for future resistance that their example had demonstrated. The autumn of 1857 brought changes to Riverside Oaks that reflected the broader transformation occurring throughout Georgia as communities struggled to process the implications of the Independence Day tragedy. The Blackwood plantation had been sold to a consortium of investors from Savannah who lacked personal connections to the enslaved population and viewed the property purely as an economic asset that could generate profits through efficient management rather than paternalistic oversight. The new ownership structure created opportunities for the Williams family to operate with reduced scrutiny while adapting to management philosophies that prioritized productivity over the complex social relationships that had defined plantation life under the previous regime. Isaac Williams found himself elevated to head overseer of all food production operations, a position that provided unprecedented authority over resources and personnel while creating new vulnerabilities that required constant vigilance to maintain his cover as a loyal servant rather than the architect of the previous summer's mass poisoning. His reputation as the cook whose vigilance had prevented even greater tragedy during the Independence Day celebration had made him
valuable property whose expertise commanded respect from the new owners who needed reliable personnel to restore the plantation's profitability after months of disruption and investigation. The irony of his situation struck Isaac with particular force during quiet moments when he contemplated how his successful revenge had transformed him into exactly the kind of trusted slave that the previous owners had believed him to be before he poisoned their entire social circle. The performance that had begun as desperate deception to avoid prosecution had evolved into a permanent identity that provided protection while constraining his future options for resistance or escape. Isaac discovered that success in fooling white society created its own form of imprisonment, as maintaining his elevated status required consistently behaving in ways that reinforced assumptions about enslaved loyalty and competence. Ruth Williams had been appointed head seamstress for the entire county, responsible for coordinating textile production across multiple plantations while managing a workforce of skilled enslaved women whose capabilities had been recognized by the new management structure. Her position required frequent travel between properties, providing opportunities for intelligence gathering and communication with underground networks that operated throughout the region. But her visibility also created risks, as her movements were monitored more closely than those of ordinary field hands who attracted little attention from authorities concerned about potential resistance activities. The transformation of her role from individual servant to regional supervisor had provided Ruth with access to information about economic conditions, political developments, and social changes that affected thousands of enslaved people throughout Georgia. Her ability to read correspondence between plantation owners and government officials gave her advance warning about legislative proposals, enforcement priorities, and policy changes that could impact underground railroad operations or create new opportunities for coordinated resistance efforts. Ruth's intelligence network had become a crucial resource for conductors and abolitionists who needed accurate information about conditions in rural Georgia. Sarah Williams had married Jonas, the overseer who had witnessed their food preparation activities on the morning of July 4th, creating an alliance that protected both of them while providing cover for continued resistance activities that required coordination between enslaved people and sympathetic whites. Jonas had proven himself trustworthy through months of careful testing that confirmed his commitment to undermining the institution of slavery rather than simply profiting from his position within the system. Their marriage represented both genuine affection and strategic calculation, combining personal happiness with practical necessity in ways that reflected the complex relationships that developed within communities under constant threat. The wedding ceremony had been conducted according to enslaved customs that emphasized community bonds and mutual support rather than legal recognition that white society refused to grant to unions between people it considered property. The celebration had drawn families from neighboring plantations who used the occasion to share information about escape opportunities, coordinate assistance for potential runaways, and strengthen communication networks that connected resistance activities across county boundaries. Sarah's marriage had essentially created a safe house for Underground Railroad operations while providing her with protection against sexual violence that threatened all enslaved women regardless of their age or family connections. Benjamin Williams had developed into one of the most effective conductors operating in the Georgia lowlands, using his knowledge of local geography and river navigation to guide escaped slaves through treacherous swamp terrain toward crossing points that provided access to South Carolina and eventual freedom in northern states. His success rate approached 90%, significantly higher than regional averages that reflected the extreme dangers faced by people attempting to escape from Deep South plantations. Benjamin's reputation within underground networks had made him a valuable resource for abolitionists who needed reliable contacts for coordinating large-scale rescue operations. His activities had expanded beyond simple escort services to include intelligence gathering about patrol schedules, safe house locations, and potential threats that could compromise escape routes or endanger conductors operating in hostile territory. Benjamin had established relationships with ship captains, ferry operators, and warehouse managers who could provide transportation, documentation, or temporary shelter for refugees fleeing toward freedom. His network extended from rural Georgia through South Carolina and into Pennsylvania, creating a pipeline that moved dozens of people annually while maintaining security that protected everyone involved in the operation. The financial requirements for supporting such extensive rescue activities had led Benjamin to develop creative fundraising methods that included selling items stolen from plantations, accepting payments from families whose relatives had been successfully transported to freedom, and occasionally intercepting shipments of valuable goods that could be converted into cash for operational expenses. The moral complexity of financing liberation through theft created ethical dilemmas that Benjamin resolved by arguing that enslaved people had legitimate claims to compensation for unpaid labor that had generated the wealth their actions redistributed toward more humanitarian purposes. Psychological transformation that each family member had undergone during the 2 years following their successful revenge reflected the broader changes occurring within enslaved communities as news of the Independence Day poisoning spread through underground communication networks throughout the South. The Williams family had become symbols of resistance whose example inspired other families to consider direct action against their oppressors while demonstrating that enslaved people possessed the intelligence and determination necessary to challenge white supremacy through sophisticated planning and coordinated execution of complex operations. Isaac's evolution from cook to resistance leader had required him to develop skills that extended far beyond food preparation to include intelligence analysis, strategic planning, and personnel management that rivaled the capabilities of military officers or business executives operating under hostile conditions. His ability to maintain operational security while coordinating with multiple networks had proven that enslaved people could function as effective organizational leaders when circumstances provided opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities. Isaac's success challenged fundamental assumptions about racial hierarchy while proving that intelligence and competence were not distributed according to skin color or legal status. Ruth's transformation from seamstress to intelligence coordinator had demonstrated that enslaved women possessed analytical capabilities that could be directed toward purposes their owners never anticipated or prepared to defend against. Her success in gathering and processing information from multiple sources while maintaining perfect operational security had provided crucial support for resistance activities that saved hundreds of lives over the course of 2 years. Ruth's achievements proved that the intellectual limitations white society attributed to enslaved women reflected deliberate educational deprivation rather than natural incapacity for complex thought. Sarah's development from frightened teenager to secure adult had occurred within the context of a marriage that provided emotional stability while creating opportunities for continued resistance activities that honored her brother's memory through practical assistance to other families seeking freedom. Her psychological recovery from the trauma of orchestrating mass murder had required support from community members who understood the moral complexities of resistance while validating her actions as necessary responses to systematic brutality that allowed no other avenues for achieving justice. Benjamin's maturation from angry young man to effective resistance leader had involved learning to channel rage into sustained action that produced measurable results for families desperate to escape bondage. His success in developing extensive networks while maintaining operational security had demonstrated that enslaved people could create and manage complex organizations that operated successfully in hostile environments over extended periods. Benjamin's achievements provided evidence that the leadership capabilities white society reserved for its own members could be found among people of all backgrounds when circumstances allowed such talents to develop. The broader impact of their actions had extended throughout the region as other families began implementing similar strategies that combined patient planning with coordinated execution to achieve goals that individual resistance could not accomplish. The Williams family's example had inspired the formation of family-based resistance cells that operated independently while sharing intelligence and resources that enhanced everyone's probability of success. The network effect created by their demonstration that enslaved people could successfully challenge their oppressors had contributed to an escalation in resistance activities that forced white authorities to implement increasingly repressive measures that ultimately undermined the economic viability of the entire system. The economic consequences of their successful poisoning operation had rippled through Georgia's plantation economy as the concentration of deaths among wealthy families disrupted established business relationships and created uncertainties that affected investment decisions throughout the region. The elimination of experienced managers and their replacement by less competent heirs or outside investors had reduced the efficiency of agricultural operations while increasing the costs of maintaining security systems that attempted to prevent similar incidents. The Williams family's actions had essentially imposed a tax on slavery that made the institution less profitable while demonstrating its inherent vulnerabilities. The political ramifications had influenced policy debates at both state and federal levels as legislators struggled to respond to evidence that enslaved people possessed capabilities that challenged the intellectual justifications for human bondage. The sophistication required to orchestrate mass murder while avoiding detection had forced white society to acknowledge that their assumptions about racial hierarchy might be based on willful ignorance rather than scientific observation. The Williams family's success had contributed to polarization that would eventually lead to civil war as northern and southern states found it increasingly difficult to maintain compromises that preserved slavery while acknowledging its moral contradictions. The legal system's failure to solve the Independence Day poisoning case had exposed weaknesses in law enforcement that reflected broader problems with governance structures that prioritized property rights over public safety. The inability of professional investigators to identify the perpetrators of mass murder had demonstrated that enslaved people could outmaneuver authorities when they possessed superior intelligence and community support. The Williams family's successful deception had revealed that the legal system's effectiveness depended on the cooperation of people who might have legitimate reasons for refusing to provide such cooperation. The medical establishment's misdiagnosis of deliberate poisoning as accidental food contamination had highlighted the dangers of allowing professional assumptions to override careful analysis of available evidence. Dr. Patterson's failure to recognize oleander toxicity had reflected broader problems with medical education that prioritized social conformity over scientific accuracy when such accuracy might threaten established power relationships. The Williams family's successful concealment of their poisoning method had exposed the extent to which professional competence could be compromised by social prejudices that prevented careful consideration of uncomfortable possibilities. The religious community's response to the tragedy had revealed fundamental contradictions between Christian teachings about human equality and practical acceptance of slavery that treated some humans as property available for exploitation by others. The inability of church leaders to provide meaningful explanations for why God had allowed so many prominent Christians to die during a celebration of American liberty had forced some congregations to confront uncomfortable questions about divine justice and human responsibility. The Williams family's actions had essentially created a theological crisis that challenged the moral foundations of Southern Christianity. The social consequences had affected every aspect of community life as families struggled to reorganize relationships and institutions that had been built around the leadership of people who had died during the Independence Day celebration. The concentration of deaths among the region's elite had created power vacuums that were filled by individuals whose attitudes toward enslaved people reflected different assumptions about appropriate management techniques. Some replacement leaders advocated for increased repression that would prevent future incidents through expanded surveillance and harsher punishments, while others argued for reforms that might reduce tensions through improved living conditions and limited opportunities for advancement within the existing system. The cultural impact had influenced everything from architectural design to social customs as white families implemented changes intended to reduce their vulnerability to future attacks by enslaved people who might possess the intelligence and determination demonstrated by the Williams family. New house designs included features that separated food preparation areas from family living spaces while providing multiple escape routes for occupants who might need to flee quickly if poisoning attempts were discovered. Social customs evolved to include security protocols that required multiple people to supervise meal preparation while restricting enslaved access to ingredients that could be used for harmful purposes. The psychological effects on surviving members of white society had created a climate of suspicion and fear that fundamentally altered relationships between enslaved people and their owners throughout the region. The knowledge that trusted servants might possess the capability and motivation to commit mass murder had destroyed the paternalistic illusions that many white families had used to rationalize their participation in slavery. The Williams family's demonstration that enslaved people could maintain perfect deception while orchestrating sophisticated revenge had forced white society to acknowledge that they might never truly understand or control the people they claimed to own. The historical significance of their actions had become apparent as news of the Independence Day poisoning spread through both Southern and Northern newspapers that interpreted the event according to their respective political perspectives. Abolitionist publications celebrated the Williams family as heroes who had struck back against their oppressors through intelligent planning and coordinated action that demonstrated the injustice of slavery while proving the capabilities of people held in bondage. Pro-slavery publications condemned the poisoning as evidence of the dangerous consequences that would result from allowing anti-slavery sentiment to encourage resistance that threatened the safety of white families throughout the South. The legacy that emerged from their successful revenge had transcended their individual circumstances to become part of the broader narrative of resistance that would eventually contribute to the collapse of slavery through civil war and emancipation. The Williams family's demonstration that enslaved people could successfully challenge white supremacy through patient planning and coordinated action had provided inspiration for other families who faced similar circumstances while proving that intelligence and determination were not limited by legal status or social position. Their example had become part of the collective memory that sustained resistance movements throughout the antebellum period while contributing to the political polarization that made peaceful resolution of the slavery question increasingly impossible. The final accounting of their achievement could only be measured in terms of the families they had helped escape to freedom, the resistance networks they had supported through intelligence and resources, and the contribution their example had made to the broader struggle for human liberty that would eventually triumph through military victory and constitutional amendment. The Williams family had transformed personal tragedy into historical significance while proving that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary results when circumstances provided opportunities to demonstrate their capabilities. Their story had become part of the larger narrative of American freedom that recognized the contributions of people who had fought for liberty regardless of their legal status or social position. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.